Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. At UFC 291, Dustin Poirier versus Justin Gaethje 2. We learned a lot about all the different fighters on the card, and this is going to be my top 3 takeaways from UFC 291. I'm going to start with some honorable mentions. I have quite a few, and then we're going to go from 3 to 1, 1 being my most important takeaway from UFC 291. Starting off with the honorable mentions, and I'm going to kind of go through these rather quickly. Some of these I might address in future videos, maybe even a dedicated video. But starting off with the first honorable mention, Priscilla Cachoeira is the biggest cheater in the UFC since Rousimar Palhares. For those of you who don't know, Rousimar Palhares was a very dirty fighter. He was a leg lock specialist, used to get submissions, hold on to them for too long, and blow out people's knees. He was cut from the organization for literally doing that multiple times, and then he went to other organizations and did the same thing. Well, Priscilla Cachoeira, she cheated so many times at UFC 291, grabbing the fence, toes in the fence, and then in the third round, she literally stuck her entire hand through the top of Miranda Maverick, and then she did a fake tap to try to get out of the armbar, which didn't work, and she's just a dirty fighter. You go back a couple fights ago, she lost to Jillian Robertson, and she attempted to gouge her eyes out to avoid a rear naked choke. Priscilla Cachoeira is one of the biggest cheaters in the UFC, and I mean, we kind of already knew that, which is why it's on the honorable mentions, but she needs to be cut from the organization, to be quite honest. She is a flagrant cheater, and there needs to be some type of punishment. Why is the commission not penalizing her? Why is the UFC not penalizing her? She literally attempted to gouge somebody's eyes out a couple fights ago, and now she's still employing dirty tactics in the cage and at UFC 291. She needs to be penalized in some way, shape, or form. Moving on to my next honorable mention, Joe Rogan's commentary is getting worse and worse. And I may make a dedicated video on this later this week. I just got to find the time to make it. But Joe Rogan was particularly awful at UFC 291. He's a casual. He's literally a casual. He's worse than a casual. He pretends as if he's a hardcore, and he doesn't even know what weight class these guys are in. And then he's watching literally 1080p footage of a guy getting hit in the nuts and then claiming he didn't get hit in the nuts. And then he's watching 1080p footage of a guy not getting poked in the eye, and he's claiming he got poked in the eye. He literally has no idea what's going on. He doesn't know half these fighters. He's just making it up as he goes, and the commentary is incredibly biased. In the Jan Blachowicz-Alex Pereira fight, the commentary was so biased, it reminded me of back at UFC 259, Jan Blachowicz versus Israel Adesanya, where the commentary was so biased in the favor of Israel Adesanya. And there's so many examples, which is why I'm thinking about making a video on it. At this point, Joe Rogan, the only thing he's really good for is leaning back and putting his hands on the other commentators and screaming, "Oh," as loud as he can for the reaction cam. I don't believe he's as invested as he once was. And he's basically just sticking around to stick around because he's been a part of it since the beginning. He's got too much going on. He's made too much money. He does not care anymore. And the commentary has just been awful. There used to be a day where I used to hate when Joe Rogan wasn't on commentary. Now I look forward to those events. I look forward to those pay-per-views outside of the country. I'm like, yes, Joe Rogan's not on commentary anymore. He literally degrades the event with his commentary, which is very sad. You know, if you go back to the days of Joe Rogan and Mike Goldberg when it was just perfect. It's nostalgia going back to those commentary days. And just looking at the vast difference, if you watched it back then, you know how much, more terrible Rogan has become in the commentary booth. His commentary at UFC 291 was atrocious. Another honorable mention, and I mean, this really, we kind of already knew this, which is why it's on the honorable mention list. Tony Ferguson is a dead body, and it really pains me to say that. He's lost 6 in a row now. I don't think he's going to retire. I don't know what we're going to do with Tony Ferguson. I worry about his mental state. And, he went out there, he got choked out by Bobby Green. The performance wasn't that great up until that point. It's not like he had a redeeming performance. Bobby Green's bottom of the barrel. He's not, I'm not saying he's a bum, but he's the lower end of the lightweight division. And there was a day where Tony Ferguson, would have absolutely wrecked Bobby Green badly in the first round. And now Tony just looks like 30% of his former self, maybe not even that. I know he got poked in the eye and he's using that as an excuse because his vision was blurred. But Tony Ferguson, somebody needs to do something. His family, his friends, his training partners, we need to get him out of the sport. I don't want to watch him take any more damage. I don't want to watch him take any more fights. I don't want to watch him face anyone in the UFC. but I don't want him to go on the Bigfoot Silva path. I really don't. This is one of the saddest stories in MMA. The rise and fall of Tony Ferguson is one of the saddest stories in MMA. And to watch him lose to Bobby Green, one pay-per-view event after Robbie Lawler rode off into the sunset was particularly heartbreaking. Moving on to my last honorable mention, and the reason this is an honorable mention, I thought about putting it on the list, but I kind of already addressed it in the previous video. I think Alex Pereira is one of the most overrated fighters in the UFC. He did not look good against Jan Blachowicz, an aging Jan Blachowicz and a gassed Jan Blachowicz. And I know he still got the split decision. I thought he lost the decision. It was close. It could have went either way. But people are acting like Alex Pereira is a shoo-in to win the light heavyweight title. He is one of the worst grapplers I've ever seen. And people are acting as if, oh, he showed massive improvement against Jan Blachowicz. Jan Blachowicz is primarily a striker. And Jan Blachowicz got his back with a body triangle. I mean, I can't remember every single one of Jan Blachowicz' fights. I don't know if he's ever had anyone in the body triangle before. We saw Alex Pereira literally make Israel Adesanya look like Khabib Nurmagomedov, 2 fights ago. And I just think the grappling is so subpar. And people are acting like, oh, well, he beat Jan Blachowicz even with the grappling of Jan Blachowicz. Jan Blachowicz has okay grappling. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying he has no grappling. But the fact that literally the worst grappler in the division is out grappling you, and I say that loosely. All right, let's say the worst grappler probably in the top 10 is out grappling you. That's not a good look for your future outcome in the division. You look at guys like Nikita Krylov. You look at guys like Alexander Rakic, and you look at guys, I know people are saying Yuri Prochazka because he fights so crazy. Don't forget Yuri Prochazka submitted Glover Teixeira, who was Alex Pereira's main coach and one of the best grapplers ever. And I know that fight was crazy and wild, but I just don't think Alex Pereira's grappling is anywhere near what it should be. He was getting out-grappled by Andreas Michailidis. I don't believe it's improving as vastly as some people are making it out to be. And the fact that you have a Jan Blachowicz who is gassed as can be after the first round, and then you still almost lost, and then people are acting like it's some phenomenal performance. I think it's a lot of people just taking into account Joe Rogan's commentary. Don't get me wrong. I think there is some things you can say, okay, well, Alex Pereira, he made his UFC 205 debut and he fought at elevation and he dealt with some early adversity against Jan Blachowicz where he had his back. I understand that. But people are acting like now it's a foregone conclusion he's going to be champion. And I just think that Alex Pereira is one of the most overrated fighters in UFC history. And I know a lot of people don't agree with that, but really that's my assessment after his entire UFC career, basically. He beat Israel Adesanya. Fair enough. He was losing the majority of that fight, and he got a 5th round TKO, standing TKO. And now people have elevated him so much off of that. And I understand why. But after seeing him at UFC 291, I don't like his future in the light heavyweight division. And I don't think he has a good chance against the majority. People are like, oh, he's going to knock out Jamal Hill. Jamal Hill would easily out-grapple him. He's going to knock out Yuri Prochazka. Yuri Prochazka, if he does decide to grapple, and that's a big if, he would out-grapple him. So I think Alex Pereira is massively overrated in the MMA community just because he has that elite level striking and because he has that win over Israel Adesanya. Moving on to my actual list, starting off with number 3. And I don't think a lot of people are going to think about this unless you were watching my live stream watch along, and I thought about maybe making a video about this as well. And my number 3 takeaway is that Derrick Lewis is about to get a fat paycheck. And I would have never thought that I was going to be saying that, because you look at Derrick Lewis prior to this fight, lost to Sergey Pavlovich, or not Pavlovich, lost to Sergey Spivak, 1st round submission. Fight before that, he lost to Sergey Pavlovich, 1st round knockout. Fight before that, he lost to Tai Tuivasa, 2nd round knockout. He was on a 3-fight losing streak, and not only that, a 3-fight losing stoppage streak. And Derrick Lewis coming into this fight kind of had his back against the wall because we didn't know it, but Derrick Lewis was fighting out his contract. And he gets this big win over Marcos Rogerio de Lima, throwing a flying knee, absorbing no damage, and finishing him in like 35 seconds. And now he comes out and he says, oh, well, I just fought out my contract. I hope the UFC re-signs me. Well, he is about to be the first ripple effect in the Francis Ngannou saga. Francis Ngannou fought out his contract and left and signed with PFL, got the biggest contract in heavyweight MMA history, and also is getting a massive boxing match against Tyson Fury, where he's making more money than he made in his entire UFC career. Well, guess what? That gave Derrick Lewis the ultimate leverage. And I know people are going to say, oh, Francis Ngannou, Derrick Lewis too. Who wants to see that? The first fight was an aberration, okay? It was a terrible fight. Fair enough. But that's not to say this matchup. People were excited for this. Dana White was promoting this matchup before they end up announcing Cyril Gane versus Derrick Lewis. He was saying the next fight, this was when he was negotiating with John Jones, the next fight is going to be Francis Ngannou, Derrick Lewis 2. Derrick Lewis earned a title shot, and he was kind of brushing over John Jones potentially getting a title shot. You can go back and find that in post fights where he was talking about that, where he did scrums. And Derrick Lewis now has an opportunity because Francis Ngannou, if the UFC does not want to re-sign him, guess what? Derrick Lewis can go to PFL for a guaranteed $2 million purse. Derrick Lewis is a popular fighter. Derrick Lewis is a fun fighter to watch. And guess what? He's not getting anywhere near a $2 million purse from the UFC. So now he has this leverage over the UFC that he wouldn't have normally had because the precedent has now been set by Francis Ngannou. And Francis Ngannou signed a deal with PFL that guarantees a future opponent at least a $2 million purse. So Derrick Lewis is going to go to the UFC and say, look, I'm looking at that $2 million purse over there at PFL. I think I'm going to head over there. And the UFC is going to have to figure out how to negotiate with Derrick Lewis because they're not going to want to pay Derrick Lewis $2 million. They're not going to want to at all. But the pettiness of the UFC and Dana White in particular to Francis Ngannou, it's going to make them have to think, because I don't think there's any universe where the UFC doesn't break out all the stops to re-sign Derrick Lewis just so Francis Ngannou can't have him as an opponent for his MMA debut over in PFL. So Derrick Lewis is the first ripple effect. I've talked about it for a while. Francis Ngannou took on the UFC and won. He had a massive successful contract signing with the PFL. He then signed one of the biggest boxing matches against Tyson Fury for a massive payday. He negotiated all these different stipulations into his contract that he wanted from the UFC, that the UFC was unwilling to budge on. And now Derrick Lewis gets to, reap the fruits of Francis Ngannou's labor here. And he gets to negotiate with the UFC. And Derrick Lewis, I know people, Derrick Lewis is so funny. Derrick Lewis is not dumb. Derrick Lewis is not dumb at all. He knows this. 100% he knows this. And I believe, in retrospect, now looking at this, I think that's why Derrick Lewis was on the prelims to begin with. Derrick Lewis was buried on the prelims. He wasn't even headlining the prelims. I get it. He was on a losing streak. But Derrick Lewis is a very popular fighter who's known for crazy KOs and viral moments, Go back to, I think it was UFC 229, where it was Khabib Nurmagomedov, Conor McGregor. Derrick Lewis takes his pants off. My balls are hot. Viral moment. When I went to UFC 244, Derrick Lewis fought on that card against Blagoy Ivanov. And Derrick Lewis got one of the biggest pops in the entire arena of the entire night, probably outside of the main event. Derrick Lewis got the most cheers at UFC 244. He's a very popular fighter. He fought out his contract. The UFC buried him on the prelims, but because Wonderboy Thompson pulled out of his fight with Michel Pereira because Pereira missed weight, they then promoted him to the featured fight on the card, and now he gets this spectacular knockout on a big pay-per-view to fight out his contract, and now he has a potential $2 million purse waiting for him over in the PFL against Francis Ngannou. And I know if that did happen, Dana White would say, who wants to see that fight again? But guess what? We can bust out the receipts of Dana literally promoting Francis Ngannou versus Derrick Lewis 2 when John Jones was calling for a heavyweight title shot from the sidelines when he was still negotiating his contract. So that is a massive takeaway. I thought about even making that number 1 on the list because a lot of people I don't think are going to pick up on that. But that's going to be a very interesting story to follow in the next coming months. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with Derrick Lewis from here. Moving on to my number 2 takeaway, and that is that Dustin Poirier may have very well had his Tony Ferguson UFC 249 moment at UFC 291. And what I mean by that is if you go back and look at Tony Ferguson's career, where is the point that everyone points to when they look for Tony Ferguson's fall off? And that was the loss to Justin Gaethje at UFC 249. Tony Ferguson got absolutely destroyed by Justin Gaethje at UFC 249. And then he's just never been the same again. He took a lot of damage. He just lost fight after fight. That was the beginning of this 6-fight losing streak. And now we have Dustin Poirier, who's one of the elite at lightweight, but he's 34 years old. I talked about this going into the fight. Both these guys, whether it be Justin Gaethje or Dustin Poirier, has taken a lot of damage over the course of their careers. They have been in a lot of wars. And now Dustin Poirier gets brutally KO'd in the second round by a head kick. Every fighter eventually has their decline. The laws of probability just tells you that you cannot stay at the top forever or close to the top forever. It's just not possible. And Dustin Poirier may have very well had his Tony Ferguson pivot moment at UFC 291, he got KO'd. He may never be the same again. I know he's been KO'd before. I know he got KO'd by Michael Johnson. I know he got KO'd by Conor McGregor back in, like 2014, 2013 in featherweight, somewhere around there. But it's different now. He's 34 years old now. He takes this nasty head kick. And what I want to point out is, think about the perception of Kamaru Usman going into the rematch against Leon Edwards. When Kamaru Usman was still the champion, a lot of people forget they fought earlier in their career. But when he lost his belt last summer, I believe it was UFC 278. Okay, think about the perception going into that fight. Think about the perception of Kamaru Usman going into the 5th round in general. Oh, Kamaru Usman's still on top. He's still doing well. He gets head kick KO'd in the 5th round. And then he loses the rematch, and it was a close fight. And think of the perception of Kamaru Usman now. Most people are like, oh, he's never going to be champion again. He's older. He suffered this KO, and then he came back and lost the decision, and he's never going to be on top again. This may have been Dustin Poirier's moment. And he's already come out and said, look, I'm not fighting up-and-comers. I don't want to fight up-and-comers. I paid my dues, which honestly annoys me, but I do understand it. Dustin Poirier has paid his dues. But at the end of the day, you're there to fight guys in the division. You're there to fight guys in the top 15. But there is a chance that Justin Gaethje's head kick KO spirals Dustin Poirier on a downslope in his career. It's hard to imagine. I know he's been fighting at such a high level for so long. The win over Michael Chandler in his last fight. The fight against Charles Oliveira, he was having success and it was in a title fight, but he inevitably loses by rear naked choke. The 2 wins over Conor McGregor, where he knocked him out in the one and the other one Conor broke his leg, but Dustin Poirier was dominating him. The fight against Dan Hooker, look how much damage he took in that fight against Dan Hooker. Go back and rewatch that fight. People forget about that fight, and people underrate that fight. He's taken so much damage. The fight against Max Holloway, people only remember Dustin Poirier winning that fight. He took a lot of damage in that fight as well. The fight against Khabib Nurmagomedov, he didn't take a whole lot of damage, but he eventually gets finished. But either way, he's been around forever. Dustin Poirier has been around forever. And you don't realize it in the moment. You never realize it in the moment. And then you look back, in hindsight is 2020, and you look back and you like, okay, that was the moment. We lost prime Dustin Poirier. Like, think about the perception. I know I keep saying that, think about the perception. But think about the perception of Tony Ferguson going into that Justin Gaethje fight. Imagine if I told you this was the future of Tony Ferguson. You would have never believed me. And there is a chance, and I hope that I'm wrong, there is a chance that Justin Gaethje sent Dustin Poirier into that downward spiral. And I hope Dustin Poirier doesn't suffer the same fate as Tony Ferguson. Dustin seems like he's made a lot of money. He definitely made a lot of money. He seems like he knows when to get out. And I don't know if he's going to hang around if he feels like he's a shell of himself. So I hope it doesn't get that far. But it happens time and time again. There's so many examples. Think about Anderson Silva going into that first Chris Weidman fight. And then think of that inevitable downslope he had from there. You never realize it when it's the end of a fighter's prime until they already are into that death slide. And then you're looking back and you're like, oh, it was there. It was when Anderson lost to Weidman the first time. It was when Tony lost to Gaethje. We've seen it time and time again. BJ Penn. We've seen it time and time again. And I think we have to appreciate Dustin Poirier because he's been in so many great fights. He's been performing at such a high level for so long. And this may have been the fight that sends him on that terrible downward slope that all fighters inevitably, go on if they stay long enough in the fight game. Now, moving on to my number one takeaway from UFC 291, and that is that Justin Gaethje is in his prime and he can still be undisputed lightweight champion. Justin Gaethje, I know he's been improving, and I've been a big believer in Justin Gaethje for a long time. I didn't pick him in this fight, but I've been a big believer in Justin Gaethje for a long time. And one thing I've always said about fighters in general, what I look for in a future champion is a fighter that comes out and shows improvement from fight to fight. That's why I always believe Charles Oliveira would be a future champion, and vastly, other fighters that I've picked out and I say, okay, I think this guy will be a future contender, future champion, is because you see that improvement, that leap from fight to fight. We're still seeing that with Justin Gaethje. Justin Gaethje came into the UFC undefeated after fighting in World Series of Fighting for a long time, and he was so unrefined. He was just a brawler who had decent technique, who just loved to chop guys' legs. And he lost a couple fights because of that. He lost a couple fights because he got wild. But he's been improving. And I know he still doesn't have the jiu-jitsu, but you go back to the Rafael Fiziev fight. Everyone was counting him out against Rafael Fiziev. He went out there, beat Rafael Fiziev. He lost the first round, but then wins the second and third round, starts incorporating that jab more, which we never really seen Justin Gaethje incorporate the jab. He was just really spamming leg kicks and throwing wild winging hooks. So he incorporates the jab in that fight. Then you see him against Dustin Poirier, starts incorporating that head kick. And we already know Justin Gaethje has all these other skills that we've already seen. We've seen that he's very durable. We've seen that he has elite level leg kicks. We've seen that he has excellent striking. We've seen that he has great cardio. And now we're seeing him add these layers upon layers to his game. And I mean, he looks so good against Dustin Poirier at UFC 291. I know he ate some shots in the first round. I thought he lost the first round. But outside of those 2 big shots against Dustin Poirier, he came out relatively unscathed in that first round. It's not like he took significant damage. So this is one of the few fights where you have Justin Gaethje not taking a whole lot of damage. So that's better for career longevity. He's shown improvement. And now he's at the top of the division in terms of #1 contender spot. We're getting Islam Makhachev versus Charles Oliveira next at UFC 294 in October. Justin Gaethje's next in line. Now, granted, there might be a detour. He might end up going to beat up Conor McGregor, but Justin Gaethje doesn't like Conor McGregor. Justin Gaethje is not going to suck up to Conor for a fight. He's already come out and said, look, you have to lose to get a fight with Conor McGregor. And also, I'm not fighting a guy on steroids. So Conor McGregor tends to like to pick these opponents based on guys who brown nose him, which is why Michael Chandler has been acting the way he has for the last 2 years. And Michael Chandler, it may not pay off for him because Conor's already saying, F Chandler, I want to fight Justin Gaethje. But I think Justin Gaethje, he's a very smart fighter. I know a lot of people, James Vick famously years ago was saying he's the Homer Simpson of MMA, which is just laughable when you look at their career trajectory since then. But Justin Gaethje's a smart guy. And Justin Gaethje knows he can make a lot of money fighting Conor, but he also knows he can make a decent amount of money fighting for that lightweight title. And he also knows he has a good opportunity to potentially win that title. And if he really doesn't like Conor McGregor, he probably doesn't want to give Conor that opportunity. Justin Gaethje wanted that Conor fight badly for many years. He wanted it when McGregor returned against Cowboy Cerrone. The UFC gave him two options. They gave McGregor 2 options. They said you can fight Gaethje or you can fight a washed-up Cowboy Cerrone. McGregor said, I'll fight a washed-up Cowboy Cerrone because, he's brown-nosing me a little bit. Also, he's an easier matchup. So Justin Gaethje may very well just not fight Conor just because he doesn't like him. But either way, Gaethje, if he does fight Conor, I think he smashes him badly. I think he absolutely destroys him. I think he KOs him badly and chops his leg. But Justin Gaethje, I never thought I was going to say this, but Justin Gaethje has a legitimate shot against Islam Makhachev. I know Gaethje doesn't have any jiu-jitsu, but if he can avoid the takedown, and that's a big if, and he can find success on the feet, which I think he is a superior striker to Islam Makhachev, but it's close because they're very different in the way they fight, where Gaethje has this crazy power and he's very dynamic, where Islam's just super technical and defensively responsible. Gaethje has probably, outside of Michael Chandler, the most power in the lightweight division, and Chandler kind of loses that power after round 1. He doesn't really have the same power he has in round 1 and round 2, where Justin Gaethje has this power over the course of the fight. So if Gaethje can find Islam Makhachev's chin, he could put him to sleep. So I'm very interested in an Islam Makhachev versus Justin Gaethje matchup for the title in 2024. And I think Gaethje could legitimately win that fight. I really do. Now, obviously, Islam Makhachev would have to get through Charles Oliveira, but if Charles Oliveira wins, there could be a trilogy, and then that really opens the door for Gaethje versus McGregor. But let's say Oliveira wins and there's no need for a trilogy. Honestly, I picked Oliveira in the first fight against Gaethje. I think I might lean Gaethje now against Oliveira in a potential rematch. That's how good he's looked. So I also think, and I talked about this with Dustin Poirier, just, my number 2 takeaway, I also think we have to appreciate the time period we are living in with Justin Gaethje, because at a snap of a finger, it could be gone. At the snap of a finger, Gaethje could get his, light shut off, and then he's never the same again. He is hitting his prime right now. The best opportunity for Gaethje to win the undisputed gold is right now, and I like that Islam Makhachev versus Justin Gaethje matchup. Honestly, if it was up to me, I'd have Charles fight one more fight. I know this is already set in stone, but I'd have Charles fight one more fight. I wish we were getting Islam Makhachev versus Justin Gaethje later this year. I know it was too quick of a turnaround for Gaethje. He said he's not taking any more quick turnarounds. He said that, a couple years ago. But I almost am more intrigued in that matchup. I'd rather Charles, rack up another win and then maybe fight Islam next year. Or if Gaethje were to beat Islam, I would like to see that rematch next year, but obviously that's not going to happen. But Justin Gaethje right now is still improving. I can't wait to see how he looks in his very next fight. He might come out and all of a sudden, we've seen him mix in wrestling against Rafael Vaziv in the 3rd round. We might see him, who knows, he might come out as a jiu-jitsu black belt. I know I'm exaggerating a bit, but Gaethje is improving and adding tools to his toolbox at 34 years old when he was already very dangerous. So Justin Gaethje is in his prime. Justin Gaethje may very well be able to win an undisputed lightweight title in the next year. And he's also one of the most exciting fighters in UFC history. We have to appreciate this moment. We have to just really take a look at these periods of time and realize the moments that we're living in. And that was one of my biggest takeaways from UFC 291. Let me know what you guys think of my list down in the comments. Is there anything that I missed? What were your biggest takeaways from UFC 291? Don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it. Don't forget to subscribe. And thank you so much for watching.